Mormon Mental Health Podcast is a production of the Open Stories Foundation and relies on donations from its listeners like you. To help keep this podcast alive, please consider becoming a monthly subscriber. Any amount will make a difference. You can click the right-hand donate button on mormonmentalhealth.org. All contributions are tax-deductible within the United States and go towards podcast production and building community support and program development for Mormons on various paths and journeys. Thank you for listening.
Hello, my name is Jeff Lundgren. Welcome to Mormon Mental Health Podcast. Today we've got a guest whose name you might know, and I can't wait to hear more about her new book and get to know a little bit more about her story. So before we get started, there's a couple things we typically start out with. Mormon Mental Health Podcast is sustained through donations. So as you can imagine, it costs something to host a podcast and all of the things. It costs about $5,000 a year. And so anything that you donate goes to cover those costs. Any donation, is helpful. And if that's not your jam, then you can participate in other ways. You can like our Facebook page, share links, tell a friend, comment, provide feedback, or just give us feedback and recommend topics because, I don't know, sometimes it's fun to talk about things that you're interested in. So let us know. Our website is mormonmentalhealth.org, and that's where you can find more information about other podcasts and all the things. Anyway, so to get back to things far more exciting than introductions, it is my pleasure to introduce our guest today, Blaire Ostler. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you. Yeah, Blaire's quite amazing. I mean, she's kind of got a toe in all of these little things. Primarily, I think she would say she's kind of this philosopher and she specializes in queer studies. And even her book really accentuates this delightful intersection of Mormon with queer, right? And so I'm excited to talk more about that. She's also got some really interesting background and participation in the transhumanistic movement here. So she's a board member there and she podcasts with Sunstone. So like I said, it's probably a name and you're familiar with her, perhaps even, she's your bestie. So either way, welcome. Hey, introduce yourself, Blaire. Tell us a little bit about you and where you came from.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm born and raised Mormon my whole life. I grew up all over the place, though. My dad was in the military, so I was a military brat. So I've attended church in like the basements of commercial buildings in Korea. And I've also attended church here in my ward in Provo, Utah. So I've had kind of an interesting and kind of broad experience with the church and growing up in the church. But I'm also like a 9th-generation kind of Mormon. So Mormonism is in my DNA. It's how I think, it's how I view the world, and it is a part of me. I'm also a queer Mormon, so I love talking about all things queer, demonstrating how Mormon is queer, all sorts of queer theory and queer philosophy. I would also say that I'm also an artist, so I do a lot of art. A lot of people don't know I have 2 degrees. I have a degree in philosophy and art, but I actually think that a lot of it really actually overlaps. Yeah, I would say that's kind of it. I have a husband and 3 kids, and I don't know, living the Mormon dream in Provo, Utah.
Yeah, lots of dreams, and that is a Mormon experience for sure.
Yes, for sure.
Fantastic. Well, I love where you come from. It's a unique thing to find people that are interested in diverse sexual orientations and identities, right? And which I want to hear more about how you define that. And also have an affinity and a strong love of church theology, at least in Mormon church theology. So yeah, it's a special, lovely place. What was it like growing up Mormon and queer for you?
Yeah, it was definitely something that I'm like, how long do you have? Growing up queer in the church was very interesting because at least when I was younger, queerness was bad everywhere. So I didn't feel like the church necessarily had to be really harsh about condemning same-sex attraction or genderqueer identities and things like that. And so in some ways, I feel like I was spared a certain amount of things that youth probably get today because the church has been even more vocal about its position on think about anything from Prop 8 to just exclusion policies and all sorts of things like that. So when I was growing up in the church, it was just bad everywhere. So the internalized shame wasn't specific to Mormonism. It was just oh, everyone knows being queer is bad, right? So that was kind of weird. So I did experience a lot of the internalized shame and gaslighting myself out of my own experience and things like that. But in some ways, I'm like, I was also spared a lot of direct, specific rejection from the church because they weren't as vocal about it back then, at least not in my experience. That could be because I went from ward to ward and had very different experiences, but that was just my experience. It was also interesting too because I've talked about it on other podcasts, but I also have an intersex biology. And so I didn't find out about those things until later in life. And so I very much was spared a lot of the internalized rejection and shame that comes from having an intersex biology too, because I just didn't happen to find out about it until I was already an adult, well, teenager adult. And that way I was kind of spared a lot of rejection. And so sometimes people are like, oh, how can you still maintain this loving relationship with Mormonism and things like that? And I think my past upbringing and the way things worked out for me, I was spared a lot of the pain and rejection that a lot of people experience in the church just because of my own ignorance. And in that way, it really prepared me to be able to be like, oh, well, I'm already Mormon, I'm already this thing, and I'm finding out all these queer things about me. That's okay. We're going to make this fit. We're going to put those pieces together and make it fit. So it was unusual. And there were definitely traumatic experiences. Like I grew up hearing all the homophobic slurs and things like that too. But people are growing, people are changing, and it's not as bad as it used to be. Thank goodness.
For sure. I see this with clients all the time. Like, so my older clients, they tend to have more polarizing attitudes towards, these things. And younger kids, this is normal for them. They're like, yes, and.
Right? Yes, and exactly.
Yeah. So yeah, it's super fascinating to see how generationally we acclimate to changing attitudes and those types of things. I remember in reading your book, which I think was interesting because I've often thought of just the label queer, right, as just another letter in this, super long, description, LGBTQIA, and most people are lucky to get past maybe an, LGBTQ, and they're like, what is it? Is the B act? Like they don't really know. Okay, wait, there's lesbian, gay, yep. B, both? No, bi, right? And then by the time they get to Q, they're all, I don't even know what Q means. And so right. I've always thought, well, that's queer, right? We're questioning. But in your book, you said, no, I like to use the word queer as this overarching umbrella that describes the entire set, because all of it is queer. And I'm curious what you meant by that. And can you educate us in terms of what the term queer means?
Yeah, absolutely. In my book, Queer Mormon Theology, I have a little brief section just clarifying queer because this word can mean so many different things to different people. As you were mentioning earlier, with older generations, there is a lot of resistance to the reclamation of this word because it was used in such a horrible, damaging, and abusive way that to be able to reclaim that and say, no, I am queer, I am proud, I am that thing, can be a difficult stretch. And just as you mentioned, like for the younger generations, it's like, yeah, queer is something else on Netflix tonight. What? Like it's barely even noteworthy. But I do have a section that clarifies queer, and I do use the word queer in a lot of different ways. And I use them ambiguously on purpose. It is intentional ambiguity. Because when we think about the word queer, we have, yes, queer as a specific identifier label for oneself. And that is how I use it for myself, because it encompasses my biological variances, my gender experience, and my sexual orientation. So for me, it's just so much more convenient to say, oh, I'm queer, as opposed to, well, I'm intersex, which makes me kind of non-binary, but also is a gender fluid experience too. Plus I'm bisexual, but it's probably more inclusive to say pansexual. So it just goes on and on and on. And so I'm just like, oh, I'm just queer. That's good enough. One of the other things I love about the word queer is it does offer a certain amount of privacy over what it means to be a member of the LGBTQIA plus community. Is that queer people often aren't afforded the idea of privacy and being able to be out without everybody having to know everything about your business all the time. What hormones are you taking? What surgeries have you had? And all sorts of other things. And it's like, you know what? I'm queer. It's a not straight thing. And that's all you need to know for now. If it comes out organically later, we can talk about that. So that's another reason I love the word queer, that it affords this sense of like privacy to oneself. It's letting you know it's non-straight, it's non-cis, or something of that nature, but it still gives me autonomy over telling the story the way I want to tell the story. But besides that, I also use the word queer as an umbrella term for the entire community. And this is really coming into favor for like the last decade or so, especially with Queer Nation, who has used the word to say, we're here, we're queer, we're proud, we're not going anywhere. And so that is the broader group reclaiming the word as, okay, this is something that isn't going away. This is something who we are. And guess what? We're actually really, really proud of this queer thing, this thing that we are. And then lastly, I also use the term just the way the term was probably originally intended. It would just mean something odd or peculiar. And that's what I really, really, really love about the word queer, because it applies to so many things, specifically in Mormonism, right? Mormons often pride themselves on being a queer and peculiar people, right? And so by being a peculiar people, like, what's that another word for them to say queer, right? That's just part of who we are. And so I use the word queer specifically within regards to Mormon theology, because it is something peculiar, it is something unique, and it's not something we need to shy away from. Let's talk about it. Let's make sure we keep Mormonism queer. Let's keep the queerness that's already there. So that's mostly how I use the word queer. And sometimes it's ambiguous, sometimes it's private, but that's probably intentional. But I'm usually always happy to answer follow-up questions about it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And your book has moments of vulnerability in it that I
Yes.
think is a part of telling the story, and that maybe that comes out in our discussion in some level. But you must have had experiences that helped promote this vigilance around your work and your advocacy. What was that?
Yeah. So one of the things that really instigated my, at least coming out process, I should say, I guess as a bisexual person in a passing marriage, it very much looks like, the question always is, well, why did you have to come out? Like, we didn't need to know that thing about you. And for a long time, I was very much content with just like my husband knowing, few family members, couple friends. It was my business. I was not out and proud. Loud and proud was not how I would describe myself at all. But it was actually the November exclusion policy that was the impetus to me coming out visibly and vocally, especially on social media. During that time, my oldest son's baptism was scheduled. And the way it rolled out, it was very unclear as if it was just anyone who identified as LGBT could not have their children baptized. And then later it was clarified, oh, they have to be in a same-sex relationship, or then their child can be baptized. Or it was like, oh, you just have to be in the primary home caregiver who is in a same-sex attraction. So all these weird things started happening. But it was very much troubling to our family, because I was like, so can my son be baptized or not? Like, it was very unclear. And then it got to the point where it's like, oh, okay, it was clear that this policy wasn't directed specifically at me. And that's when I was like, oh, and that's the problem. Mm-hmm. You didn't direct the policy at me, yet I'm still a member of this community. And because you don't see me visibly, you get to keep ignorantly thinking that there aren't queer people sitting next to you in the pews. And that was not okay. I also felt a lot of conflict and sadness about the fact that my son was spared from this policy of exclusion that would bar him from baptism. But yet my bi friend, who's in a lesbian marriage, her children were not spared. Her children could not be baptized, but mine could. Yet we're both bisexual. And that very much triggered in me, like, our children are the same. Our children all deserve the waters of baptism. This is something that doesn't need to be weeded out in this very political kind of way. Whether you're queer or not, this is not the issue that we should be like driving our stake in the ground in. So once those things happened, I had a conversation with my husband, and I had a conversation with my kids, and I was like, because when you're a parent, coming out is not just about you anymore. This affects everyone in the family. But I was like, okay, everybody in the family knows that mom's bisexual. I'm going to start being open and talking about this more, because I think it's very important that people know that while they're trying to exclude queer families from the church, the families that look straight are actually queer families too, and they're in the church too, and people don't get to live in ignorance anymore, by thinking that bisexual people and het marriages are just another form of straight. So I came out, and it was a very strange experience. It was very much people I had been friends with for years were suddenly disappearing, and people who I had served and the primary presidency with were suddenly gone, and people I'd served in young women's presidencies with, and all sorts of things. It very much demonstrated all the things I had feared inside, that if you knew me, you wouldn't like me. And so our friendships were already built upon this lie, in the sense that you only liked me because I was straight. And once you found out I was bisexual, all of a sudden we weren't friends anymore. And I feel like that was the hardest part of it, was letting go of those relationships that I was afraid were built upon straight ideals. And then it was actually confirmed. Oh, that is what that relationship was about. The fact that you thought we were both straight, and that made everything okay. On the flip side, so many wonderful things happened as well. I met so many incredible, beautiful, wonderful queer Latter-day Saints all across the LGBTQ plus spectrum. And so many of them welcomed me with open arms and caught me as I felt like I was free falling from a plane. And one of the things was, there wasn't a ton of bi representation. And I knew one bisexual woman, and she very much was a mentor and leader to me in helping me navigate this space, especially when bi erasure is very much still a thing. And I very much feel a lot of gratitude specifically to that friend for helping me navigate that space as a bi person. But back to your original question, the impetus of this was the policy of exclusion. And it's really kind of funny, because the whole point was to weed out the queers, but really you just made a lot of us more visible to the community and in the pews, because it wasn't a big deal until they made it a big deal. They made it a big deal. Like I was that person. I was that bisexual who was like, I'm fine in the closet. I don't need to come out, blah, 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 blah. Like, oh, then you go after the kids. Well, it's another story. I mean, yep. I'm a primary president. What did you expect me to do?
And then this became personal for you, as the attitudes of very close friends, or perhaps just friends in general, then changed, right?
Yes.
Because you decided to show up in the world in a way that was unexpected to them.
And yes, I would also add to that, I also have had friends throughout the years who left and then came back after a family member came out or a child came out. And suddenly I'm getting messages and calls and PMs from people who are like, oh, what do I do in this situation? And I'm like, oh, I'm so glad this loved one in your life came out and we can be friends again, because boy, do I have a lot to share with you. But no, there are ups and downs, but overall, I wouldn't change a single moment. I am glad I came out when I did, not a minute too soon and not a minute too late. It really was when I needed to do that for me.
Right. And that's, I think, true for anybody, right? Whether that's older, younger, like, doesn't mean it's easy, but it will happen when it's supposed to be right.
Yep. Amen.
Right. So, it's funny, as you talked about the exclusion policy, and there's this really subtle irony. It's almost as if you can pick a binary on the spectrum, gay, bi, trans male, right? Then now we can categorize you in the pariah group, right? Or the group that you can't receive this experience, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
But if you're fluid, right, or questioning or queer, you're okay. When that's probably, like, if binaryhood is something that the church aspires to, is at least, I don't know whether it's legalistic or just trying to wrap your arms around something and make it concrete. It's just ironic that the group that typically is more fluid, which might signal more debauchery, which is not my opinion, not yours, obviously, right? But just this, non-binary sexuality is probably worse than identifiable, non-accepted sexual orientations and identities.
Well, yeah, absolutely. If you think about what is going to challenge the hierarchy, authority systems and structures and organizations of a church, it's going to be that interweaving of the non-binary, that bleeding of the spectrums and cracks and things like that. I would say one of the biological realities that challenge that binary system more than anything is intersex people, because our bodies are literally born with non-binary biology. And so the common assumption seems to be, for a lot of people, not all people, but the common assumption seems to be, oh, that's a mistake. We'll just correct it and fix it, and we'll get you all set up in the binary system. Pat on the head, everything's okay. But I just don't believe that. I just don't believe that these things about me or my body or whatever are some sort of mistake. The interesting thing about something being a mistake is, like, I kind of get to decide if it's a mistake or not, because it's my body, it's my wants, it's my desires. If it's not operating according to my desires, then I get to decide, yeah, that was a mistake because I want this thing instead. And so when someone comes in and wants to patronizingly, like pat on the head, it's okay, sometimes God makes mistakes, I'm like, which mistake were you referring to? Not me, because that's not right. Because it's very, the relationships Mormons have with science and scientific evidence is a very interesting one, because I would say generally Mormonism, or even the church, it's definitely not I would say ignorant or anti-science by any means. In a lot of ways, it's very pro-science. So when you talk about the science of bodies and gender and biology and anatomy and things like that, that's going to be one of the more challenging things for people, because it's not just about your gender expression. It's not just about your performance or who you love or who you marry. This is about literally children being born into the world with this anatomy that doesn't fit a binary system. And the only way people know how to deal with it is to say, oh, it's a mistake. We're going to either drug you, cut you up, whatever we need to do to make sure you fit that surgically constructed binary system. And so that, along with the idea, people also want to make the excuse sometimes that because intersex bodies are rare, that they're not worthy of consideration. And I think that's also a silly argument too. Yes, gender and biology is a bimodal thing. Most people fall on certain ends of the spectrum, but just because that middle area is there and because it's small doesn't mean it's not worthy of consideration as it is. I mean, I think we recall Jesus saying something about going after the 1 in 99. He's clearly making a point that even small percentages are important. So we need to acknowledge and recognize the small percentages. But there's a lot of work to do before, like, your average Latter-day Saint is like, yes, bring the intersex people to whatever meeting they identify with according to their gender.
For sure. And it's super interesting. And I think a lot of the latest research is actually echoing what you're talking about. The fluidity in the center probably is a larger segment of the population than what we may have identified in the past, right? Because we have cultural attitudes that polarize us in wanting that kind of definity, which is fine. But how do you take somebody who's like, yes, I have always identified as being gay, and now they're like, most of the time I am, right? And so, yeah, I love what you're talking about. I love what you're doing. Let's kind of shift gears a little bit. I'd love to, because your book is fascinating. It says, look, Mormonism is diverse. It's different. It's the gospel message that Christ puts forth, that we adopt, especially in the manner in which we adopt it, says that there is variance and there is acceptance and there is grace and there is curiosity that's organically built into the framework of Mormon thought. Can we draw from that and say, does the capacity of this aspect of our Mormon tradition give us a bridge to allow for queerness in terms of the things that we've been talking about? And you do it in such a fascinating way. Tell us more about queer theology and how does that like reconcile the queerness of Mormonism? Like, talk about that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I definitely make the argument in the book that Mormonism itself is already inherently queer. And in many ways, people are trying to unqueer that and trying to demonstrate how, see how nice we fit into the heteromonogamous nuclear family model. Here we are. Like, how do you take like Marxist sex radicals, from 100 years ago and transform them into the poster children of heterosexual monogamy. That's what we're looking at, right? And I don't mean to idealize the past too. There's a lot of like racism to unpack and in the erasure of indigenous peoples and things like that. So I don't mean to idealize the past as far as like, weren't our ancestors perfect? No, they weren't. But there was a sex radical influence there that was happening already in the origins of the church.
I remember you talking about polygamy in the book. I mean, what a strong example. It's almost like we could say in modern, with our modern lexicon, is it possible that Brigham Young preferred non-monogamy? Right?
I know, right?
The answer is yes, right?
Yeah.
Or something, but I'm sure he wasn't the only one, right? And so what does that say? And anyway, carry on.
Well, yeah, no, it definitely was so challenging to the time that the U.S. government threatened to seize their assets, right? So it definitely was, I would say, a peculiar and queer practice, to say the least. One of the things I do in the book with my queer polygamy model, and there's also an article written about it in Dialogue, if people want to go read it there as well, is that the queer polygamy model, like, it's really funny. It really has one of the most provocative titles that you could possibly imagine. Like, you're merging these two totally taboo topics, and I'm like exploding them together. But really, the thesis of that entire chapter really is people should be sealed to the people they want to be sealed to, and people should not be sealed to people they don't want to be sealed to. It really is just a long, drawn out way of explaining different sealing practices, marriages, and our responsibilities to one another as community members, and just recognizing that being sealed together in an interconnected heavenly family really is about mutual consent and agency. And so if we engage in those in more positive ways, I also make the argument that queer polygamy is so queer that even heterosexual monogamists can come to the celestial kingdom with us. Because I'm really trying to make the argument that we need to make space for a diversity of desires. And I know the title itself is provocative. And sometimes I get so caught up in my own queer theology ideas. I'm like, of course this is. I mean, it's so regular to me that sometimes I forget for other people it's not quite as regular. But really, even though it has a provocative title, it really is just, if people are desired to be sealed together, whether that's as a friendship, as a family member, as parent-child, or a spouse, like, people should be able to be sealed to the people they want to. I also talk about it in more detail as far as like single people, because within Mormonism and within Mormon theology, being single is a type of queerness, so to speak. Like, we don't really look at single people the way we look at married people, at least culturally speaking, and theologically too. And so I also make the argument in queer polygamy, look, if you are someone who's single, and let's say you want to remain single, whether you're, heterosexual, asexual, homosexual, whatever, if you want to be single, then you shouldn't have to be promised in marriage to be able to attain the highest degree of glory. Because in the community of God, when we all come together and we're all sealed together in this big eternal heavenly family, single people can be sealed to friends, to parents, to nieces and nephews. We can all be sealed together in different types of relationships. And it doesn't always have to necessarily revolve around the heteronuclear monogamous family model. That just doesn't work for a lot of people, not just the LGBTQ community, but also single people too. So the queer polygamy model really is just saying, we're all really different. We all want different things in life. We can be sealed together because we love each other.
Right.
And if you don't want to be sealed anymore, you shouldn't have to be either. So for example, another one of the arguments I make is for children who no longer want to be sealed to, like, say, an abusive parent or family member, a thing like that. People should be able to have more control over, or women have to go through extra hoops to be unsealed in certain situations and things like that. And I go through that in a little bit more detail in the book as well. And that people who don't want to be sealed to be certain people, that there should be a more equitable way for them to be unsealed to people who they feel are toxic relationships. Because sealings for the sake of sealings, that's not going to do anyone any good anyway. So these sealings really need to be predicated more on autonomy, trust, consent, and that really is more the vision and what I call in the book the spirit of polygamy the spirit of polygamy is the love of community. And as you are a part of that community, you should be able to choose how and where you're going to be sealed to people.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's so interesting. I have adult female clients that are active members of the church and have no desire to get married. Now,
Yeah.
they're not seeing me because things are going well in their life. They're seeing me because things aren't going well. And as it centers around this topic, it's because they don't feel like their queerness, which is, as you've described, not necessarily, they may be very, heteronormative. They may be, sexual beings, right? They don't identify asexually and all the things. Yet they don't feel they have a voice of acceptance because they're not married, right?
Absolutely.
And
Well,
that's been tough.
it's particularly difficult for women too, because there's still a binary segregation of women being able to have their own social autonomy in the church without a patriarch, mainly priesthood ordination, right? It can be difficult to navigate a patriarchy without a patriarch in hand. And so to this point, I mean, I don't envy the position of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles of the Q15 at all. I do not envy that leadership position and having to juggle all these different wants and desires and things like that. But I will say it can be very tricky, because there is a point in which you do yourself a disservice when you don't empower your single women, and all women for that matter, or anyone independent of gender, with priesthood ordination, because some of your most active and ardent participants are not even given the tools to be able to go out and get the work done. It would be like being an expert hole digger and then not giving your best hole diggers a shovel. It's like, get that woman a shovel. She's going to go do amazing things with that shovel. So I don't know when the time is right. I obviously think the time was right like 10 years ago, but I do think ordination of all genders is something that is an important aspect of queer theology, because even as a cis woman, it's like almost a sense of, it's one deviation, it's one queerness level away from the central patriarch, the white heterosexual cisgender male. And so, and the further and further you get from that, you have to recognize, look, we're all in the gospel somewhere here. It's not just all about homogenization or sameness. It's about recognizing and celebrating our diversity, but recognizing maybe everyone needs a shovel, okay? Because we could get a lot more work done if everyone had a shovel.
Or if somebody has a shovel and they don't want to be shoveling.
Ooh, excellent point. Excellent point. Exactly.
I mean, not every kid who's 12 years old wants to be passing a tray of bread or water around to the congregation.
Yeah.
For whatever reason.
Yep.
And there really isn't a lot. I mean, patriarchy is, we're kind of, dipping our toe in that water. It certainly is harmful for many women on some level. And it's also harmful for many men in different areas. This would be one of those areas, right?
Amen. Patriarchy hurts everyone. It really only helps with a select group of people right on the top. It hurts tons of men.
For sure. Yeah, your book is super interesting. And I love that the audience of your book could be both very queer affirming, and whether you identify in that umbrella or not, maybe you're just an ally into the community, you're going to find a home in the words and content. And I believe that many very believing members of the church will also find the content uplifting.
Yeah, that is definitely one of the intentions of the book. I wanted it to very much be an uplifting and hopeful book. There's not a lot of hopeful and uplifting queer Mormon content, and reasonably understandably so. I'm not here to gaslight anyone or anything, but I did want this to make people feel a sense of hope, a sense of inspiration, a sense of awe and curiosity, everything you mentioned before. And with that, I also wanted to write to more than just one audience. So as I was writing, primarily I had queer Mormons in mind, and being like, hey, this is a possibility of what it might look like someday. Of course, you don't have to share my optimism. Of course, you don't have to see it this way, but I just wanted to show you this vision. I just wanted to show you this picture. However, in the process of doing that, I realized, oh my gosh, queer Mormon theology isn't just Mormon theology for queer people. That would be a misunderstanding of it. queer Mormon theology is recognizing it's almost redundant to say queer Mormon theology, because I'm really just stating Mormon theology in just a way you haven't seen yet. So it's not even something, I wouldn't even say, like, I don't want to say new, because it is new ideas for some people, but it's all predicated with scriptures, talks, all sorts of things that have come before this really have just prepared Mormonism for this queer inclusive gospel. So it was already there. And which is funny, because as I was writing the book, I realized it more and more, because I'm just like writing Mormon theology and I'm like, oh, it's already queer. I'm not reinventing the wheel here. I'm just showing you the wheel that's right over there. And that's what I think is like one of the special things about it, is that queer Mormon theology is really kind of how straight people should be looking at Mormonism too. It's room for you, it's room for me, it's room for her, it's room for him, it's room for them. Like, it really is meant to be this big old body of Christ working together towards, more godly aspirations and goals.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes someone's experience in the church doesn't contain that, right? Whether or not they were injured, hurt, traumatized in whatever way, they can't find this space.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know. And I have a small thing in the introduction dedicated to just that, just to make sure that, like, no one misinterprets this book as a way for this is what it is, and you should be this thing, and you should be faithful, and blah 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 blah. This is not that book. This is not a prescription. This is not a book you hand to your queer friend and say, see, she gets it. No, 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 no. That's not what this book is at all. This is one person's queer vision of what hopeful things could look like. My relationship with my fellow queer Latter-day Saints is, I love you. I think your queerness is a godly part of who you are. I support you, no matter if you're in a gay bar or in the temple. I support you. This is a very difficult and tumultuous time queer Mormons are going through right now. And I do not expect anyone to share my optimism, share my vision, or have to be able to feel like they're in some way less than because A, they didn't see it this way, or they don't feel it. Because if you don't feel it, trust those feelings. Trust yourself. So hopefully, anybody listening to this right now, please don't give your queer family member this book and say, see, please don't do that. Every queer person is figuring out this path the way each of us needs to, and not one of us is going to have the same path.
Right, for sure. How has this work of yours affected your mental health? Like, in what way has this changed you?
Yeah, that is the question, isn't it? So for anybody who's been following me on social media, it has been quite a journey, and people have been able to see some of my lower moments and some of my happier moments, and me processing this. Part of the reason I was so open about my mental health and my journey and things like that is because I felt like, if I'm experiencing this, odds are someone else out there is going through this too. Someone else is struggling. Someone else is having a hard time with this, or even just conflicting feelings about this. Sometimes I'm really happy about some of these queer Mormon things, and then other times I feel really sad. And so it really has been a roller coaster event. But for me personally, and what I had to do for myself more than anything, I can't not be Mormon. I don't want to not be Mormon. It's very much part of who I am, and I like being a Mormon. That doesn't mean I like everything about Mormonism or everything about the church or everything about our culture and things like that. It means I am a Mormon and part of who I am. On the flip side, I am queer. I am biologically queer, gender queer, sexually queer. I am very much queer, and I like being queer. That doesn't mean I love everything the queer community has done, or there hasn't been trauma there, or sometimes I didn't wish, maybe I wish I weren't the thing anymore. But overall, I'm queer and I like being that thing. So here I have these two parts of me, literally, like, I feel like DNA woven throughout my body, in my veins, and everything inside of me saying, you are Mormon and you are queer. And everything outside of me is screaming, no, 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 you can't be that thing. And it really, in some ways, can feel like someone is literally just trying to rip you apart, like a surgeon with a scalpel trying to cut through which parts are queer, which parts are Mormon. Let's separate these. Let's put them into categories and silos. They can't mix. And it can sometimes feel like it reaches a point where it's just like unbearable. It's just stop, just stop. And so in the process of writing this book, this is definitely, just as much as it is an intellectual endeavor, it is also very much a personal endeavor for me to reconcile these seemingly oppositional identities that sit within me. And it's like, how do we reconcile this? And there is a certain level of peace that comes from reconciliation, right? You can like kind of exhale and you can kind of feel affirmed. And granted, I know that not everyone is going to share, my views of queer Mormon theology, and they'll have other interpretations of Mormonism or queerness that show how these can't work together. And so I'm not suggesting like it's like this for everyone, but for me, being able to reconcile my Mormonness with my queerness has been able to put me in a space and a mental headspace of like, honestly, I dare I say, not having to hate myself, not having to hate who I am and ask why these things, why this biology, why this body, why was I born into this religion, why, and really it was a certain amount of like existential philosophy to be like, for me to at least chart my own path. And I was asking all these questions, why, and I'm like, Blaire, you know why, to reconcile them, to show, to do the things which are inside you. If you can, I mean, again, I don't want to have any ideas of grandeur that like, this is going to change everything and everything will be great again after this book. It won't. I don't think that at all. But I do think that in the process of writing this book and hopefully showing others that there is a possible path, that hopefully this will offer a sense of relief to anyone who's just like, why would my heavenly parents make me this way? Where do I fit in the body of Christ? So that, well, here's one person's take on that. And I think you fit, and I don't think you need to change or become something you're not just to be a part of the body of Christ or just to be a part of the heavenly family. You're just as godly as anyone else. And it's given me tremendous relief in my own life, mental health wise. And I'm really hoping that, it'll help a few other people too.
Yeah. And as you describe that, I'm thinking, how powerful can it be for someone who might identify as queer or whatever label that they choose and choose not to affiliate with the church because they feel that the church is inherently problematic for them and they own it, right? Now, they could even advocate for that, much in the way there's a little bit of advocacy, which I think I'll comment on after this next question, because I think you may even answer it. But it's perfectly acceptable for somebody to say, yes, I identify as gay, and I think that the church is very harmful. And I'm going to own that, and I'm going to dissect, do my own introspection, my own work, and create that kind of reclamation that has the same power that you're describing in your experience in a different way.
Well, and absolutely, I would even say I actually agree with everything you just said. Yes, you are gay or queer or whatever you are, and the church is harmful. And I love queer Mormon theology. Like, it really can be all the things, or it can be none of the things, or different things. But
Right.
Exactly what you're saying, reclaiming and reconciling the narrative can be totally different conclusions for whoever is coming out of it.
I think life is better experienced if you feel that you're in control of the direction of the happenings versus being an obstacle in a river of current that you feel out of control. Right?
Absolutely.
So yeah, you demonstrate this. I think that's just amazing. What are your hopes for the book? What do you imagine coming out of this experience for you or others?
Well, honestly, so some of my hopes have already been beyond exceeded. In some ways, I remember writing parts of this book, or I should say editing parts of this book, and commenting to my husband, like, I'm tired. I don't even think anyone's going to read this. Like, what? This is going to be too weird for people. No one's going to be into it. And the book hasn't even been out like a week. And people are already giving back amazing feedback, and people can't wait to read some of these ideas. So my first hope was that someone would pick it up and read it. That's my first hope. And that's actually happening. And I feel unbelievably grateful and blessed in that department. My next hope for the book is that once people have read it, that they kind of internalize it and start thinking about things differently. So, like, let's say you're a parent of a queer child and you still go to church, but maybe your queer child doesn't go to church anymore. But once you've read this book, I guarantee you, you will never sit through gospel doctrine the same way again. You just won't. You won't go to Relief Society and think the same thoughts again. You're going to be thinking, I want people to think queer thoughts. That's what I want. And so once you've read the book, it changes your thoughts. It internalizes these things. And then the next hope would be for people just to raise their hands and be like, you know what? I have this thought. You're saying that XYZ about Jesus Christ, but what if XYZ about Jesus Christ? And to be able to engage in that conversation in a faithful or scriptural based foundation is going to be a very powerful thing. That's one of the things about the book too. Like there's 500 plus scriptural references in here. So if anybody's just like, oh, you're just making things up, I'm like, nope, it's in your scriptures. I mean, we could talk about our interpretations of that, but it is in your scriptures, in our scriptures. And so 1, read it. 2, internalize it. 3, raise your hand and say something. Just raise your hand and say something. It's going to be the impetus for conversations that actually need to be had for policy to actually change. I make this point in the book too, that changing our policy, sometimes we focus so hard on the policy, which is super important, by the way, not dismissing the importance of policy, but changing policy without theology is just empty. It has to be within the framework of our theology. If we're not doing that, it's just kind of like, what are we doing? We're just doing anything now, So by having it within the bounds of our theology, it really starts these interesting conversations to say, hey, there's more than one way to interpret this. There's more than one way to hear what the scriptures are trying to tell us. There's more than one way for us to engage in this conversation. And one of the beautiful things about theology and Mormonism, it is weirdly democratic. The church is not run by theologians. It's not run by, Hebrew scripture professors. It's run by businessmen and doctors and lawyers. And so we don't have a specific theology group sitting here saying, this is the theology. And so there's a lot of room in there for the average Latter-day Saint to have these really interesting conversations, these weird conversations about like, I don't know, do gods go through menopause? When I become a god, am I still going to have an ovulation cycle? We get to ask these weird kinds of questions because we're not run by, theologians. And the hope is for this book is to start queer conversations and start talking about, ask these questions and what is this going to look like? This book is not about save it for another day or this will all work out in the end or blah, blah, blah. It's about right here, right now. What does this mean for us? Sometimes people get so caught up in the idea of eternity being this thing down the road, this thing for later. But eternity is made up of an endless series of right now. Right now is queer Mormon theology. Right now is eternity. Eternity isn't over there. It's not back there. It's right now. Eternity is always now. And so if we engage in these conversations, ask these hard questions, and dive deeper into these things, I guarantee you we're going to have a lot more humility about where queer people belong in the church when we're asking questions about how do God see time in the cosmos of eternity when we can't even, think past living 110 years at most. Like, there's a lot of humility to be had in queer Mormon theology. So that is really my hope for the book, to start these queer conversations so people can really see that, there's so much we don't know, but let's dive in anyway. And let's ultimately love and compassion, Jesus's number one commandment. Love God, love each other, love your neighbor, love yourself. That's the first and foremost commandment. If we keep that at the core of the conversation, it's going to be a lot more productive.
Yeah, I totally agree. My big takeaway from the book was this. I think you and I would acknowledge that the church is struggling to identify itself in a way that retains its membership.
Yeah.
That's what I think, right?
Yeah. Well, I think that's true across the board. I mean, a lot of research has shown that. So yeah.
Right. And not unique to the church in and of itself. Other Christian denominations are experiencing a secular wave of, things happening. But the church particularly, I think, is struggling with how do we do this? How do we retain the orthodoxy and the principles and the adherence and all of the things and preserve that at the same time without having everybody just walk away? It's a big challenge. Your book to me came across as the antidote. It to me represents the line of thinking that allows for what I think has been a trajectory of rigidity and a lack of acceptance and a lack of openness. This seems to me like, hey, this is who we are. We know how to do this. Let's do this. Let's do this in a way so that everybody feels like they have a voice. Right. And their person and their identity and their belief systems have a home that is both malleable on their own journey and for those people that want to be a part of the church covenant path, air quotes, right, that they could participate in a way that makes sense for them.
Yeah. Okay. Well, one, thank you so much. Flattered by your commentary on my book. And second, the key you're touching on here, I think, is again, this idea of how do we get past the rigidity? It's really the rigidity that's hurting a lot of people, whether it's just rigidity in LGBTQ issues or just being single or not, or gender binary. That's just some of it. But even more rigidity, like, do you take the scriptures literally or metaphorically? Do you believe in a literal XYZ or a metaphorical XYZ? We have all these rigidities happening that keep separating people to say you can't both inhabit the same space unless you believe the exact same way or the exact same thing. And it's that type of rigidity that's doing ourselves a disservice. It's a disservice in our Sunday school lessons and talks and all sorts of things. And so with queer Mormon theology, part of it is also getting past that rigidity. You can 100% be an atheist and still read this book and hear parts of what I'm saying as applicable in certain ways. And you could also be a 100% literal believer and be like, oh, I can hear parts of what she's saying in here too. So in queer Mormon theology, I'm trying really hard to get past that layer of rigidity to where you have to take the scriptures literal or metaphorical or whatever, that either way, you can still read this and get something out of it as like, oh, I get what she's trying to say. And we can have, again, those queer conversations, right? And it is sad sometimes too. It does make me sad. And I'm really open about the fact that I don't really attend church anymore. I worship in other ways. I still hold to a lot of Mormon beliefs, but I don't really attend the pews. And one of the reasons is that because we have one of the most incredible, beautiful, radical, deep theologies and cosmologies, but you never know that if you walk into a gospel doctrine class sometimes. Like, sometimes it feels like, well, and I'm obviously generalizing here. I'm sure there are a lot of delightful gospel doctrine classes that go into the depth of, the metaphysics of God, physiology, sure. But I just think that generally speaking, we like to stick with what's correlated, and whenever there's something outside that correlation, oftentimes it's treated with hostility. And that's what's sad, because so much of the good parts of Mormonism are in the correlated lesson manual. And so we have all these incredible things we could be talking about, but we don't talk about it. And so that's what I wanted to do. Some of it, I was like, I just want to talk about these things. I just want to go to gospel doctrine. Yeah, exactly. I'm like, I did.
The part of like, I didn't even know if I want to bring this up, but I'm just going to make everybody smile. Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane experienced everything.
Yeah.
What was it like for him to experience his first menstrual period?
Yeah.
Cycle, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Did he really? Okay. Well, yes, no. Like, does it really matter? Like,
exactly.
Let's just accept that as a basic principle of Christianity, that Christ took upon him sin and understood everything for in every way, not just for cisgender white men and gendered women. He understood it all. What does that really mean? So even the way in which you described that, I think in the book was just, it was wonderful. It was delightful.
Oh, I'm so glad. That was definitely one of my favorite parts. I think it's chapter 3 on
I think so.
Christ. And again, you touched on it so beautifully, is because whether you believe Gethsemane was real or whether you believe it's fan fiction, it almost isn't it's not the crux of the argument.
No.
The crux of the argument is, if you believe this thing according to the narrative, Jesus is really going through something really queer in Gethsemane. He's having a period, he's having childbirth, he's having testicular cancer, he is having all the things happen in some sort of way, whether you believe that to be a literal physical thing or a metaphorical thing. Either way, it's queer.
For sure. And not definitive, right?
Exactly.
Well, we'll find out in the next life. The Lord will take care of it. Well, that's queer. How do people find you?
Yeah, I spend a ridiculous amount of my time on Facebook. So you can probably find me on Facebook, or you can read some more of my work on my website, which is blaireostler.com. It's usually got links to podcasts and articles and things like that it wrote. I'm also on Instagram and Twitter, but Twitter terrifies me, so I'm never on Twitter. If you just go to my website or Facebook, you can definitely find me there.
Excellent. And I think at some point here, if it isn't already available, your book will be on Amazon and all the things.
It is available right now, so anybody who wants to go buy it, it's on Amazon on Kindle, and it is on paperback. And I have got word that it has now been approved for an eventual audiobook. So that'll
Fantastic.
be exciting.
Congratulations. I'm excited for you. And thank you so much for your time. You articulate these things with a passion, and it's intelligent, and I just love your advocacy and your work, and your personality just kind of really showcases this. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me on. This was wonderful.
You're very welcome.
Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Mental Health Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please help us and become a monthly subscriber at mormonmentalhealth.org. The goals of this podcast include education, advocacy, and the mental health and general well-being of Mormons and their families. We can't further this work without your support. Music for this episode was provided by the Lower Lights.
Over life's tempestuous sea, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me, unknown ways before me roll, hiding rock and treacherous show, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me.
As a mother stills her child, thou canst hush the ocean wild, wondrous sovereign of the sea. Jesus, Savior, pilot me.
Boisterous wave, obey thy will, when thou sayest to them, be still. Wondrous sovereign of the sea, Jesus, Savior, pilot me. when at last I near the shore, and the fearful breakers roar, may I hear thee say to me, fear not, I will pilot thee. Twixt me and the peaceful rest, then while leaning on my breast, may I hear thee say to me, fear not,